Chapter 1. The Deserted Planet. The winds of Zardalan howled endlessly, carrying the bitter cold that stung the skin and cut to the bone. The sun, a pale shadow of its once blazing self, barely gave any warmth as it dipped below the jagged mountains in the distance, casting long shadows across the cracked and barren plains. The atmosphere of Zardalan was thin, nearly unbreathable, and the temperature dropped drastically each night, freezing any unprotected life to death. And yet, despite the deadly landscape, a small figure moved across the rocky terrain, a tattered cloak wrapped tightly around her thin body. Princess Ailina, the last of her kind, stumbled forward, her legs shaky from hunger and exhaustion. Her delicate green skin had turned a sickly pale from the cold, and her golden eyes, once filled with the light of hope, now reflected only the endless desolation of this cursed planet. It had been weeks since the coup that had torn her kingdom apart, since the betrayal that had shattered her life. Her own advisors, the men and women who had sworn loyalty to her family for generations, had turned on her, siding with a rival faction in the hope of seizing power. Ailina had barely escaped the palace, fleeing in a stolen ship as explosions rocked the capital behind her. But the traitors had not been content to let her escape. They had chased her through space, forcing her to crash land on Zardalan, a remote and uninhabitable world. Her people had left her to die. Ailina's breathing was ragged as she reached the edge of a rocky cliff, her knees buckling as she collapsed into the dust. She had nothing left, no food, no water, and no strength. Her body was failing her, and her mind had long since surrendered to despair. She had tried to send out a distress signal, but the planetary communication systems were down, and no one was coming for her. The galaxy had forgotten her, just as it had forgotten her people. The once proud princess lay in the dirt, her hands clutching the cracked and dry ground as tears streaked her cheeks. She had dreamed of being a great leader, of rebuilding her father's empire and restoring peace to the galaxy. But now, those dreams were nothing more than distant memories, fading away like the last light of the dying sun. As she lay there, waiting for the end to come, her mind drifted back to her childhood, simpler time when she had visited far-off worlds and met with strange and wonderful creatures. One memory, in particular, came to her now, unbidden but welcome. She had been only a child when her father had taken her to Earth, a small blue planet on the fringes of the galaxy. There, she had met humans for the first time, strange beings with their soft skin and short lifespans. But there was one creature that had fascinated her above all others, a dog named Rex. Rex had been a gift from the human ambassadors, a genetically enhanced canine bred for intelligence and loyalty. He had been assigned to Ailina's protection detail during her stay on Earth, and she had quickly grown attached to him. He had followed her everywhere, his eyes always watching her with a quiet devotion that she had never experienced before. Rex had been more than just a pet. He had been her friend, her companion, her protector. But that was a lifetime ago. Ailina had long since left Earth, and she had never seen Rex again. She had often wondered what had become of him, whether he was still alive, whether he remembered her. Now, as the darkness of Zardalan closed in around her, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that somewhere out there, Rex was still looking for her, still searching for his princess. But it was just a dream, a foolish hope in a galaxy full of cold indifference. No one was coming to save her. She was alone. Or so she thought. Far above the desolate planet, in the vastness of space, a small ship drifted through the darkness. It was a simple craft, unremarkable in design. But inside it, something extraordinary was happening. In the control seat, a lone figure sat, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. His hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting the ship's course as he followed a faint signal that only he could sense. Rex had been searching for weeks. Ever since the coup on Ailina's homeworld, he had been tracking her scent, following her through the vast expanse of the galaxy. His human handlers had tried to stop him, but Rex was no ordinary dog. He was a genetically modified canine, designed for rescue missions, with heightened senses and a fierce loyalty that could not be broken. And more than that, he had a bond with Ailina, a bond that went beyond training, beyond instinct. She had saved him once, and now he was determined to return the favor. The ship's sensors beeped softly, indicating that they were approaching the planet Zardalan. Rex's ears perked up, his tail wagging slightly as he recognized the faint traces of Eilena's scent. She was here. He had found her. But time was running out. Zardalin was a dangerous world, and Rex knew that Eilena would not survive much longer without help. He had to reach her, had to save her, before it was too late. With a low growl of determination, Rex activated the ship's landing thrusters, guiding the craft down toward the surface of the planet. As the ship descended, Rex's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what he would find when he reached Eilena, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not leave her behind. Not this time. Chapter 2. The Loyal Search begins. Rex stood at the edge of the landing ramp, his keen eyes scanning the horizon as the harsh winds of Zardalin buffeted his fur. His enhanced senses were already at work, his nose twitching as he picked up the faint traces of Eilena's scent on the wind. It was weak, barely there, but it was enough. She was close. The landscape before him was bleak and unforgiving, jagged cliffs, endless plains of cracked earth, and skies darkened by swirling clouds of dust and ash. It was a planet that had been abandoned by life long ago, and now, it was a graveyard for those unfortunate enough to be stranded here. But Rex didn't care about the dangers of this world. All that mattered was finding Eilena. He trotted down the ramp, his paws kicking up dust as he moved swiftly across the rocky terrain. His training kicked in as he began to systematically search the area, his nose guiding him toward the faint scent of his princess. He moved with purpose, his body low to the ground as he followed the trail, his ears twitching at every sound, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Rex had been bred for missions like this. His human handlers had trained him to rescue soldiers trapped behind enemy lines, to locate survivors in the aftermath of battles, to navigate dangerous environments with precision and efficiency. But this mission was different. This time, it wasn't just about duty or orders. This time, it was personal. Eilena had been kind to him when no one else had. During her stay on Earth, she had treated him not just as a guard dog, but as a friend. She had played with him, talked to him, fed him treats from the palace kitchen. She had even let him sleep at the foot of her bed, something no one else had ever allowed him to do. It was a small kindness, but to Rex, it had meant everything. And now, she needed him. Chapter 2. The Loyal Search begins. Rex's senses were sharper than any ordinary dog's. As he piloted the small rescue pod toward the barren surface of Zardalin, he caught the faint, almost imperceptible scent of Eilena lingering in the thin atmosphere. The stench of sulfur and decay permeated the planet, but Rex was undeterred. His training as a rescue canine, enhanced by human technology, allowed him to focus solely on his mission. Princess Eilena was still alive, and he would not stop until he found her. The small craft touched down on the jagged, rocky surface with a soft thud. Rex leaped from the pod as soon as the hatch opened, his powerful legs carrying him swiftly across the uneven terrain. The cold winds of Zardalin whipped at his thick fur, but he ignored the biting chill, his senses completely focused on the task at hand. Eilena's scent was faint, but it was enough for him to track her. She was close, but in what state? Rex could only imagine. The surface of Zardalin was a desolate wasteland, dotted with jagged rocks and deep ravines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The sky above was perpetually gray, with thick clouds that blocked out any hint of the sun. It was a planet designed to kill, hostile, unwelcoming, and devoid of life. Anyone left here for more than a few days would surely perish. But Rex knew that Eilena was different. She was strong, despite her fragile appearance. He had seen that strength in her even as a child, when she had shown kindness to a scrappy earth dog who had been bred for war. Now it was his turn to return that kindness, to show her the same loyalty she had once shown him. As he moved swiftly through the barren landscape, Rex's enhanced hearing picked up the faint sound of movement in the distance. It was a subtle noise, barely audible over the howling wind, but Rex's keen instincts told him it was Eilena. His heart pounded in his chest as he increased his pace, weaving through the rocks with the agility of a predator. The scent grew stronger as he neared a small, crumbling structure nestled between two towering rock formations. The building was barely standing, its walls cracked and weathered from years of neglect. Rex sniffed the air, confirming what he already knew: Eilena was inside. With a burst of energy, Rex sprinted toward the shelter, his powerful legs propelling him forward. He reached the entrance, a broken doorway hanging off its hinges, and pushed his way inside. The air was thick with dust, and the interior was dark, but Rex's enhanced vision allowed him to see clearly. And there, huddled in the corner, was Ailina. She was a shadow of the proud princess Rex remembered. Her once vibrant green skin was now pale and gaunt, her golden eyes sunken and dull from hunger and exhaustion. She wore a torn and dirty cloak, her body shivering from the cold. She looked up as Rex entered, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Rex?" Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked from dehydration and fear. She blinked, as if she couldn't trust what she was seeing. Rex padded toward her, his tail wagging slightly as he approached. He nudged her gently with his nose, as if to say, "I'm here, and I'm not leaving you." Tears welled up in Ailina's eyes as she reached out to touch his fur, her fingers trembling. I thought I was going to die here." Rex let out a soft whine, licking her hand in reassurance. He could feel how weak she was, her body barely able to hold itself up. She had been through so much, abandoned by her people, left to die on this forsaken planet. But Rex had found her, and now that he was here, he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Ailina collapsed against Rex, her body trembling as she leaned into him. His warmth enveloped her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Rex had come for her. Against all odds, in the vastness of the galaxy, he had found her. "I don't know how you found me," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "but I'm so glad you did." Rex nudged her again, this time more firmly. He wasn't here for emotional reunions, he was here to save her. Time was running out, and they needed to get off this planet before it was too late. He barked softly, urging her to stand. With great effort, Ailina pushed herself to her feet, using Rex as support. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she managed to stand, leaning heavily on her loyal companion. Rex barked again, this time louder, as if telling her to hurry. There wasn't much time. "I'm coming," Ailina muttered, her voice weak but determined. She followed Rex as he led her out of the shelter, his body pressing against hers to keep her steady. The cold wind hit them as soon as they stepped outside, but Rex shielded her from the worst of it, keeping her close as they made their way toward the rescue pod. Ailina's strength was fading fast, but Rex wouldn't let her fall. He stayed by her side, guiding her across the rocky terrain as they moved toward the small craft. As they reached the pod, Rex nudged Ailina inside, his eyes scanning the horizon for any potential threats. The desolation of Zardalin offered no immediate danger, but Rex knew better than to let his guard down. They weren't safe yet. Ailina collapsed into the seat inside the pod, her chest heaving with exhaustion. She looked at Rex with a weak smile, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rex let out a soft bark, settling down beside her as the pod's engines roared to life. They were leaving Zardalin behind, escaping the planet that had nearly claimed her life. As the pod lifted off, Ailina leaned her head against Rex's fur, her eyes closing as sleep finally overtook her. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe, and as she drifted into unconsciousness, she knew that no matter what happened next, Rex would always be there to protect her. Chapter 3: A Bond Unbroken. The escape pod trembled violently as it pierced through the upper atmosphere of Zardalin. The alarms blaring inside the cockpit were deafening, shrieking warnings about failing systems, fuel depletion, and structural integrity. Princess Ailina's fingers danced across the control panel, but her movements were sluggish, her mind foggy from exhaustion and hunger. She gritted her teeth, trying to focus, but the strain of weeks spent surviving on the desolate planet had sapped most of her strength. She was a shadow of the princess she once was, and every second that passed made it harder to fight the encroaching darkness of unconsciousness. Beside her, Rex sat still, his large brown eyes fixed on her face. The genetically enhanced dog had positioned himself to shield her from the worst of the pod's violent jerks. His instincts were sharper than any machine, and he could sense her struggle. Ailina's hands, trembling from weakness, were a far cry from the graceful and sure movements of the royal pilot she had been trained to be. But Rex didn't judge her. He simply stayed by her side, nudging her gently with his nose when he sensed her fading focus. His soft whine cut through the noise of the failing systems, reminding Ailina that she wasn't alone. I'm trying, Eilina whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. She glanced at Rex, her golden eyes dull with exhaustion but filled with gratitude. I'm trying, boy. Rex barked once, a short, sharp sound that seemed to pull her back from the brink of giving up. He could sense her flagging will, and he would not allow it. He had crossed half the galaxy to find her, to rescue her from this death trap of a planet, and he wasn't about to let her slip away now. The pod lurched again, throwing Eilina against her seat, and she gasped, struggling to maintain control. The atmosphere was thinning, but the transition between the lower and upper layers of Zardalin's atmosphere was turbulent, violent. The pod was shaking so hard that the metal creaked, groaning under the pressure. Warning lights flashed on the display, each one screaming that they were moments from disaster. Eilina's vision blurred, and her fingers faltered on the controls. The lack of food and water had taken its toll on her body, and every movement now felt like a monumental effort. Her eyelids drooped, her head lolling forward as her body threatened to shut down completely. But Rex wasn't about to let that happen. With a soft growl, Rex nudged her hand again, this time more insistently. His body pressed closer to hers, radiating warmth and strength. He licked her fingers, the familiar touch pulling her back from the edge. Eilina blinked rapidly, shaking her head as if to clear the fog. She couldn't afford to black out. Not now. Not when they were so close to escaping this forsaken planet. Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she had left, Eilina forced herself to focus. She took a deep breath, her hands steadying on the control stick as she adjusted their trajectory. The escape pod shuddered again, but this time, the violent shaking began to ease. They were breaking through the atmosphere, reaching the uppermost layers where the air was thin and the turbulence less severe. Eilina could feel the change in the way the pod handled, the engines no longer straining against the heavy pull of Zardalin's gravity. But they weren't out of danger yet. The display flickered, and a new set of alarms blared critical fuel depletion. Eilina's heart sank as she glanced at the fuel gauge. It was nearly empty. The pod had barely enough fuel to reach the outer orbit of the planet, let alone carry them to safety. If they ran out before reaching a stable orbit, they would plummet back to the surface, their fragile craft disintegrating upon re-entry. I don't know if we're going to make it, Rex. Eilina muttered, her voice cracking. Her hands gripped the controls tighter, her knuckles white from the strain. She glanced at Rex, her eyes filled with the weight of hopelessness. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But Rex refused to give up. He let out a low growl, his ears pricked up, and his eyes locked onto hers with a fierce determination. There was no room for defeat in his mind. He had found her. He had brought her this far, and they were going to make it. Somehow, they were going to survive. Drawing strength from Rex's unwavering loyalty, Eilina gritted her teeth and adjusted the pod's course. If they couldn't make it to a safe orbit on fuel alone, she would have to use the planet's gravitational pull to their advantage. It was a dangerous maneuver, one wrong calculation, and they would be sucked back into Zardalin's atmosphere, where the pod would burn up on re-entry. But Eilina had no other choice. Her fingers flew over the controls, adjusting their trajectory to sling around the planet's orbit. The escape pod shuddered as it changed course, the engines straining under the new calculations, but they held. For now, the pod arced around Zardalin, the planet's massive gravity pulling them closer as they accelerated. The thin atmosphere gave way to the darkness of space, and for the first time since they'd left the surface, Eilina could see the stars twinkling in the distance. They were so close to freedom. But the fuel gauge was now flashing red, and the engine sputtered, choking on the last few drops of fuel. Eilina held her breath, her fingers gripping the controls as the pod hurtled around the planet. They were moving fast, too fast, but if her calculations were correct, they would slingshot just far enough to reach a stable orbit before the engines died. Rex, sensing the tension in Eilina's body, pressed closer to her, his warm fur a comforting presence in the cold, sterile interior of the pod. His eyes never left hers, as if he were silently telling her to trust in their bond, to trust in the strength they shared. The pod's engines gave one final sputter and died. Eilina's heart skipped a beat as the lights on the display dimmed, the alarms falling silent. They were now drifting, completely at the mercy of the planet's gravity and momentum. For a few terrifying moments, The pod shook violently as it approached the critical point where it would either be flung into space or pulled back toward the planet. Ailina held her breath, her hands gripping the controls so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could feel the tug of Zardalin's gravity pulling them closer, threatening to drag them back into the atmosphere. But then, with a sudden lurch, the pod broke free of the planet's gravitational pull. They were in orbit. Ailina exhaled a shaky breath, her entire body sagging in relief. They had made it. Against all odds, they had escaped Zardalin's deadly grasp. The stars stretched out before them, and the cold, dead surface of the planet slowly receded into the distance. Rex let out a soft whine, pressing his head against Ailina's hand. She smiled weakly, running her fingers through his thick fur. "We did it, boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We made it." But their journey wasn't over yet. The escape pod was adrift in space, its fuel depleted, its systems failing. They had escaped Zardalin, but now they were stranded in the vast emptiness of space with no way to call for help. Ailina glanced at the communication console, her hope fading as she saw the damage. The pod's communications had been destroyed in the crash landing. There was no way to send a distress signal. They were alone. Her heart sank, but she refused to give in to despair. Rex had brought her this far, and she wasn't going to give up now. She had to believe that someone would find them, that there was still hope. As she leaned back in her seat, her body finally succumbing to the exhaustion that had plagued her for days, she felt Rex curl up beside her. His warmth was a comforting presence, a reminder that she wasn't alone. And as the stars stretched out before them, Ailina closed her eyes, trusting in the bond that had carried them this far. They had survived Zardalin. Now, they just had to survive the endless void of space. Chapter 4. Hope in the Void. The silence of space was all-encompassing, a vast, eternal stillness that pressed down on the escape pod as it drifted through the void. The cold interior of the craft felt like a tomb, with only the soft hum of the failing life support systems to break the quiet. The stars outside twinkled in the distance, indifferent to the plight of the two passengers now stranded in the endless sea of darkness. Ailina's body was heavy with exhaustion, her muscles sore from the long weeks of deprivation and stress. Despite the thin warmth provided by Rex, who lay curled up at her side, she shivered. The temperature inside the pod had begun to drop as the power systems continued to fail, and with no way to restore the engines, the air would grow colder with each passing hour. She knew the grim reality they faced. Drifting without power or communication in the far reaches of space, they had no way of knowing if help was coming or if it even could. Zardalin was a remote planet, and it had been weeks since the coup on her homeworld. Anyone who might have come searching for her would have long since given up hope. But Rex had found her. Rex had believed in her when no one else had. Ailina looked down at the loyal dog beside her, her fingers gently stroking his fur. His eyes remained alert, scanning the darkened cockpit for any sign of danger, though there was little to see. Despite the dire circumstances, Rex remained steadfast, his unwavering loyalty a beacon of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. "I don't know how you managed to find me, Rex," Ailina whispered, her voice barely audible in the cold air. "But you did. You always had that strength in you, even when we first met." Rex's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, and he let out a soft whine, as if to remind her that he wasn't about to give up. He pressed his head against her hand, his warm breath a small comfort in the otherwise frigid atmosphere. Ailina smiled weakly, though it didn't reach her eyes. She had never been one to give in easily, but the reality of their situation weighed heavily on her now. The pod systems were failing one by one, and it was only a matter of time before the life support shut down completely. Once that happened, the temperature would drop to lethal levels, and the oxygen would thin until there was none left. But she couldn't give up. Not after everything Rex had done to find her, to save her from that desolate planet. If she gave in to despair now, it would have all been for nothing. They had survived Zardalin together. Now, they just had to survive this. Her fingers fumbled with the emergency systems panel, hoping to find something, anything, that might buy them more time. The fuel was gone, the engines offline. But perhaps there was still a way to send a distress signal, even if it was weak. The panel flickered to life under her touch, the screen displaying a series of red warnings and error messages. Ailina's heart sank, but she pushed forward, navigating the damaged system with shaking hands. She bypassed the non-functional systems, her eyes scanning for any surviving communications array. And there it was, a single line of hope in the midst of the chaos. The pod's emergency beacon. It was barely functioning, its power levels critically low, but it was still there. Eilena's breath caught in her throat as she activated it, sending out a weak signal into the depths of space. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small pulse that could, with luck, be picked up by a passing ship or station. Rex looked up at her, his eyes wide and hopeful. He sensed the change in her demeanor, the spark of hope that had been reignited in her chest. "I did it, Rex," Eilena whispered, her voice hoarse with relief. "I sent the signal. Now we just have to wait." But waiting was the hardest part. Hours stretched into an eternity as they floated through space, the cold growing more unbearable with each passing moment. Eilena's body ached from the freezing air, her breath visible in front of her as the temperature plummeted. The life support systems were on their last legs, barely keeping the atmosphere breathable, and the dim lights of the cockpit flickered ominously. Rex, ever the vigilant protector, stayed close to her, his fur warm against her skin. He didn't understand the complexities of space travel or the dangers they faced, but he knew one thing: Eilena was his to protect, and he would do so until his last breath. Time dragged on, and Eilena felt her eyelids grow heavy. She hadn't slept properly in days, and the cold was making it harder to stay awake. But just as she began to drift into a fitful slumber, a soft, faint beep echoed through the cockpit. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She leaned forward, her fingers fumbling with the controls. The display was faint, but there it was, a response to the distress signal. A ship, somewhere out there, had picked up their beacon. Eilena's hands trembled as she activated the comms, her voice shaky. "This is Princess Eilena of the Zardalan Empire," she began, her words coming out in a rush. "We are stranded in an escape pod. Our coordinates are attached. Please, if anyone can hear this, we need assistance." For a few agonizing moments, there was only silence. Eilena's heart raced as she waited, every second stretching out like an eternity. But then, through the static, a voice crackled over the speakers. "This is the Starlight Dawn," the voice said, clear and strong. "We've received your distress signal, Princess Eilena. We're en route to your location. Hang tight. We'll be there shortly." Relief flooded through Eilena, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They were saved. Rex barked softly beside her, as if he, too, understood that their ordeal was finally coming to an end. Eilena reached down to stroke his fur, her fingers trembling with emotion. "We did it, Rex. We're going to be okay." The minutes that followed were a blur of anticipation and gratitude. Eilena's body was numb from the cold, her movements sluggish, but the knowledge that help was on the way kept her awake, kept her fighting. The Starlight Dawn, a massive freighter, appeared on the horizon like a beacon of hope, its engines humming softly as it approached. With a gentle thud, the ship's docking arms latched onto the escape pod, and the hatch opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Warmth flooded into the pod, and Eilena shivered, overwhelmed by the sudden change in temperature. Rex, ever vigilant, stayed close to her side as the rescue crew entered. A tall figure in a sleek uniform stepped forward, extending a hand to Eilena. "Princess Eilena," the officer said, his voice warm and reassuring. "You're safe now. Let's get you and your companion aboard." Eilena nodded weakly, her legs barely able to support her weight as she stood. Rex pressed against her, helping her walk as the crew guided them toward the safety of the ship. As they stepped aboard the Starlight Dawn, Eilena felt a wave of warmth wash over her, both physical and emotional. They had survived. Against all odds, they had made it. And as she collapsed into a soft seat, Rex curling up beside her, Eilena knew one thing for certain: no matter what happened next, she would never forget the loyalty and love of the dog who had crossed the stars to save her.